Shabbat Shalom, everyone. As you know, over the past week, our beloved state of Israel has made international headlines, but not because of Israel's challenges with her enemies, but for internal reasons. After weeks and weeks of mounting demonstrations against the government's judicial reform bills, hundreds of thousands of Israelis took to the streets on Sunday night when the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, announced that he would fire his defense minister for speaking out against the legislation. Then on Monday, just a few days ago, we saw an unprecedented nationwide strike that brought Israel to a standstill. Stores, banks, universities, even Ben Gurion Airport, everything shut down. Even some reservists threatened to refuse call-up orders. This was as close to a revolution as the modern state of Israel has ever seen. And finally, by Monday night, Netanyahu said he would postpone the legislation to take a timeout for dialogue until the next session of the Knesset, which is in May after the Passover recess. The judicial reforms that the current government is proposing would completely change the overall structure of the Israeli government. Under the proposals, the government would have control over the appointment of judges, and the Knesset would gain the power to override any Supreme Court decision by just a slim majority of 61 out of 120 votes. Now, those supporting these reforms tend to be more religious, more traditional, and come from some of Israel's more disadvantaged neighborhoods and towns. They're the ultra-Orthodox and the working-class Mizrahi voters. They're the bedrock or the more conservative elements in the current Israeli government. The opponents of the judicial reforms tend to be part of Israel's more secular, middle, and upper-middle classes. They're startup nation, those who make up the more cosmopolitan elements of Israeli society. The wealthier, more Ashkenazi educated class of the coastal Tel Aviv and Haifa regions. Now, opponents of the judicial reform say it threatens the foundations of Israeli democracy, a point that can be debated. But in many ways, and perhaps more importantly, they're protesting more than just judicial reforms. Dr. Tomer Persico of the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem explains it well. He points out that the protesters are out in the streets not solely over these judicial reforms. They're protesting because they feel that that delicate balance that's been part of Israeli society, that Israeli social contract, has been broken. It's that contract that says it's that same balance that ensured economic prosperity alongside funding the ultra-Orthodox yeshiva world. Simply put, we always knew that Israel is not Canada, but most secular Israelis were willing to fund large, voluntarily unproductive communities as long as they were not too much of a burden and as long as they did not interfere in their everyday lives. In the last few decades, the maintenance of this delicate balance was a signature achievement of the longest-serving Israeli prime minister ever, Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu was never as popular on the scale of Begin or Sharon, but the deal he offered to Israel was popular and was satisfactory from the point of view of most of its citizens. Economic prosperity and an increase in the standard of living alongside funding for the ultra-Orthodox autonomy. But as soon as those religious communities who now make up the government decided it's time to dictate to the entire country what the public square would look like, a line was crossed. The balance was broken. And now for the first time, Netanyahu and his very traditional and conservative coalition are promoting moves that demand even greater investment in ultra-Orthodox sectors and threaten to impose their religious norms on the public space. My friends, this is the real jet fuel in the engine of the protest movement. Those protesting want to be sure that their government will continue to protect their interests to maintain that delicate status quo. And now that a timeout for dialogue has been called, what's the way forward? Perhaps the upcoming holiday of Passover offers an answer. At this time of year, I receive a lot of questions about Passover. And the most common question, it's not, Rabbi, what kind of matzah should I get? Or is kinyot okay? The most common question I get, it's, Rabbi, how long does my Seder have to be? And I tell people, don't judge your Seder on how long it is. It's not about reading every single page of the Haggadah. Rather, that Haggadah, that beautiful booklet, that book that we use every Seder, that Haggadah demands that in each generation, each person, every single Jew, is obligated to see himself or herself, lirot et atzmo, as though he or she personally came forth from Egypt. At the Seder, we feel part of the Exodus. That's the hope. And we do it through the customs and the unique foods and genuine, tangible discussion. And so don't judge a Seder by its length. It's not how long you can go. Judge it by the dialogue and the discussions on what it means to be a free Jew in our postmodern world. And let me suggest this year that we discuss at our Seder tables what's happening in Israel, because it has ramifications for life in Israel and for us here in Houston. Because Passover reminds us we're all Jews. It doesn't matter what we look like, where we were born, how observant we are, or our status or stage in life. On Passover, we can all say, this is my story too. God took me out of Egypt as well. God brought us all out of Egypt. And this beautiful spring holiday reminds us that we will continue to survive as a people when we see each other's narratives as our very own. That we're all part, all of us, all Jews, are all part of the continuing miraculous story that is the Jewish people. And yes, we Jews have our differences. We always have and we always will. We see it here in Houston. Beth Israel and Beth Yeshurun Jews lived very different lives than Beit Rambam and young Israel Jews. We have differing customs and worldviews. We don't always see eye to eye, and that's okay. This is not a Pollyannish view that we can just learn to get along. We won't always agree on everything. But if we no longer see each other as part of the same ongoing story, then we won't survive as a people. We're too small. We have too many enemies. And we have too precious of a history and tradition to do otherwise. And the question now for our friends in Israel is, will Jews in Israel rise above to still see each other's stories as their own? Because the way forward in Israel lies with a leadership that is able to formulate a shared ethos, where the contribution of all Jews, all parties, all types is recognized, and all ways of life are protected. With an ever-changing Israel, we're just like here, polarization is increasing. Only time will tell if that's even possible. I pray that it is. And I want to end on a positive note, because as Rabbi Fort reminded us last week, I'm the sunshine to her dark clouds. A story from last Thursday night's protests. Last Thursday night, as it's been for the last several weeks, was a day of disruption. And the demonstrators in Tel Aviv against the judicial reform announced that they would, for the first time, expand their protests to Bnei Brak. Now, you may be familiar with Bnei Brak. It's actually mentioned in your Haggadah. It's been around for a long time. And today, Bnei Brak, which is right next to Tel Aviv, is a city of 240,000 almost exclusively ultra-Orthodox Jews. And of course, their political parties support the judicial reform. where the protesters are, of course, against the judicial reform. And as imagined, police prepared for violent clashes between the more secular protesters and the more religious residents of Bnei Brak. What happened next, however, nobody expected. Normally on Thursday nights, those ultra-Orthodox men, those Haredi men, they don't stay at home. But in places like Bnei Brak, they hang out at bars. But it's not your regular type of bars or clubs that you could ever imagine. But they're what's called cholent bars. Now, you may know what cholent is. It's that wonderful, traditional, hearty and filling dish that's made from a variety of ingredients, beef or chicken, potatoes, beans, barley or other grains. It's slowly cooked overnight and left to simmer for many hours. And the long cooking time allows the flavors of the ingredients to meld together. It's a beautiful and wonderful treat on Shabbat afternoon and on Thursday nights in most ultra-Orthodox areas. Now, I've never been to a cholent bar in my life, but cholent is good. And maybe I'll go there this June when I get to go to Israel. But this last Thursday night, the religious leaders of Bnei Brak told their men, don't go to the cholent bars like you normally go, stay at home. So there was a lot of extra cholent. And if it wasn't eaten, it would go bad. So when those secular protesters entered Bnei Brak expecting the worst, some of the city's Orthodox Jews greeted the demonstrators with drinks and a lot of cholent. Jewish music was played, and people actually danced. And in many ways, it was probably the first time for many of those present that they had met people who were so opposed to their own lifestyle. Orthodox Jews and progressive Jews, traditional Jews and more secular Jews finally spoke to one another. You can find these incredible videos online. And the videos online are really something to see. And I want to point out one of those videos. One of the videos is of a secular man from Tel Aviv who entered Bnei Brak with a helmet on, like a motorcycle helmet. He was expecting people to throw things at him. But you can find a video of him taking that helmet off, dancing and singing to Shalom Aleichem, crying and dancing with Haredi Jews. Because in the end, the potential violence turned into a celebration of peoplehood. And this story surprised a lot of people in Israel. But it was a reminder that we Jews can still share the same story. It's when we have a chance to talk to one another. We're not led astray by leaders who are trying to pin us apart, But we have a chance to talk to each other, acknowledge our differences, but realize that we have a lot more in common and a lot more similarities than differences. As long as we continue to do so here in Houston and right now, most importantly in Israel, we will be okay. That's my prayer this Shabbat in this upcoming Passover. Shabbat Shalom and happy Passover.